Last week we talked about how the Gulf War could have been avoided. It wasn't, of course, but believe it or not, that wasn't the biggest mistake of that whole ordeal. Let's talk about what actually was one of history's biggest blunders. After kicking Iraq's butt in the war, Bush Sr. had Saddam Hussein right where he wanted him. It was like holding a loaded gun with the safety off. But instead of pulling the trigger and ending this nightmare, he decided to play it safe. Hi, my name is Sebastian, and you're watching Mistakes That Changed the World. The Gulf War was a shocking display of American military might. With the Iraqi army defeated, the American-led coalition had everything in place to remove the brutal dictator of Iraq, but that didn't happen. Just imagine for a moment if Bush had just finished the job. How many innocent lives could have been saved, I wonder? We probably would have avoided the whole chaotic mess of the Iraq War of 2003, which in itself is kinda mind-blowing, right? So let's break down exactly what went wrong. Before the big showdown, everyone was making huge mistakes. The West thought Saddam was all talk, and Saddam thought the world was too scared to do anything. We already knew this guy was a total monster from what he did to the Kurds, and then the horror stories started coming out of Kuwait. It was quite insane. The West tried diplomacy, but Saddam was a stubborn dude. He was describing these negotiations as flagrant Western imperialism. Bush called it giving peace a chance. In truth, it felt more like kicking the can down the road. The UN finally had enough of Saddam's crap and gave him a deadline. Get out of Kuwait or else. Bush rallied the troops, and with Congress on his side, Operation Desert Storm was born. This wasn't your grandpa's Vietnam War, though. The US military was like a well-oiled machine, dropping bombs on Iraqi targets with insane precision. And Saddam's fancy palace got a taste of that American firepower. In the first attack alone, 1,700 airplanes were launched and only one was lost. As mighty and deadly as these airstrikes were, they were also very precise. It seemed like the coalition actually cared about civilians this time. No more dropping bombs willy-nilly. This was a whole new approach. The West was bombing the hell out of weapons factories, storage facilities, communication centers, air bases, and bridges, but they tried their best to avoid areas where civilians were at risk. Meanwhile, Iraq was launching their Scud missiles against Israel and Saudi Arabia, but the US was like, not on our watch. They shot down most of them. To be perfectly honest, the Americans feared that a possible Israeli involvement in the war would alienate predominantly Muslim countries from the coalition. Even in such a dire situation, Saddam was still being a stubborn bastard. He was burning everything in sight, oil wells and refineries I mean, so it was time to step up a notch. General Colin Powell and General Schwarzkopf decided that enough is enough and launched a full-on ground attack, and it was a complete blowout. The invasion began on February 24th, and by the 26th, Radio Baghdad announced that Iraq will submit to UN conditions. It was a textbook example of military dominance. At this critical moment, in a pivotal miscalculation, President Bush ignited a spark without providing the fuel. By urging Iraqis to rise up through airdrop manifestos, he recklessly exposed the population without offering military backup. While post-war conditions demanded Kuwait's liberation and prisoner release, the glaring omission was the absence of a demand for Saddam Hussein's prosecution. Perhaps Bush believed political defeat would topple Hussein, but the dictator's iron grip on the military thwarted this expectation. The ensuing Intifada, a courageous popular uprising, was met with brutal suppression as the US military watched helplessly from the sidelines. While some claim they didn't seek direct combat, many Intifada members assert that basic military equipment would have been invaluable. Yet, these pleas fell on deaf ears. America had become a reluctant spectator, having recklessly encouraged rebellion only to abandon those who dared to heed the call. Tens of thousands of Shiites were brutally murdered in this conflict, many by chemical weapons, the very weapons America had vehemently denounced. Yet this horrific reality was largely obscured from the public when Bush prematurely declared victory. The haunting images of the Highway of Death, a convoy of retreating Iraqi forces bombed by US forces, further alienated public opinion, making the ongoing involvement increasingly difficult to justify. Even Margaret Thatcher, no stranger to tough decisions, was appalled by the decision to leave Saddam Hussein in power. She argued for a complete and decisive victory, warning that a half measure would only embolden future aggressors. Tragically, she proved to be prophetic. In the decade that followed, Hussein's regime continued its reign of terror, mocking the world with renewed defiance. Democracy remained a distant dream, and the specter of WMDs once again cast a long shadow over Iraq. So, the US and its buddies rolled into Iraq like a wrecking ball, and in no time they kicked Saddam Hussein's ass out of Kuwait. But then, weirdly, they just stopped, leaving Saddam still chilling in Iraq as the big boss. Now, the official story is that they only came to save Kuwait, but that's kinda BS, right? Because they stayed in Iraq for a while, setting up no-fly zones. Some people say it was cause they were scared of what would happen if Saddam wasn't in charge. A power void in the region could have made things worse. Others think they didn't want to mess with the whole Middle East too much. Either way, it's like they left a ticking time bomb in the region. The psychopathic dictator would gleefully drop toxic gases on his own people and tighten his grip on the country's political power. So maybe Bush Sr. was just tired of dealing with the whole Iraq mess. That's a pretty simple explanation, but it kinda makes you wonder why his son thought otherwise. Because fast forward a dozen years, and the US is back in Iraq, this time with a vengeance. It turned out that, surprise surprise, leaving Saddam in charge was a mistake, and it exploded in everyone's face. The ensuing Iraq War from 2003 was a lot messier than the first one. Thousands of innocent Iraqis and coalition soldiers lost their lives in a war that could have been finished in 1991. We're still dealing with the fallout of this mess today. It's hit the global economy, foreign policy, and even the West's peace of mind. So, next time you hear someone talking about cutting and running, remember Iraq. Most times, the hard choices are the right ones. But hey, that's just my opinion. What do you think? Why was Saddam Hussein left in power? Let me know in the comments downstairs. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest blunders. If you enjoyed this episode, remember I have a Patreon page so you can support what I do here. I'd like to thank my long-standing patrons Dan and Lawrence Neal for the continuous support. In the meantime, as always, I do hope to see you next time. Bye.